LiSTNR production.
This is Crime Insiders Detectives, where we go behind the headlines and into the minds of those who live and breathe criminal investigation.
Friday night he went to another party. I think he was a bit of a ladies' man.
In this episode, we're joined by retired Detective Inspector Mel Gundry, a name well known to anyone who's followed some of Queensland's most high-profile homicide investigations.
Couldn't take my eyes off him. He was walking around this Prado like he was wanting to take the scent away from the other car.
Mel brings decades of experience to the table, and today he walks us through two cases that captured national attention: the murder of Allison Baden Clay and the tragic death of Sean Sargent. He takes us behind the police tape. This is raw, honest and deeply revealing. A rare look inside major crime from a detective who's lived it. I'm former police officer Brent Sanders, and for the past 25 years, I've dedicated myself to sharing what I've learnt on the force to the Australian public so they can better protect themselves from falling victim to crime. So with the help of some of the most respected current and former detectives and high-ranking law enforcement agents, we're going to pull back the curtain on what life is like on the force and what they've learned about how crime and criminals really work. These are real stories from real detectives.
There were, a number of people that had seen or believed to have seen Sean Sargent after he'd been reported missing in pubs and clubs around Brisbane, and also at a camp site around Byron Bay, and a truck driver claims that he saw Sean Sargent in New South Wales. We obviously spoke to those persons again. They gave evidence at the coronial inquest. The information was probably not as accurate as initially thought.
Mel, on the 20th of March 1999, Australian Army Lieutenant Sean Sargent, he disappeared in the early hours of the morning after attending a party at St Lucia there in Brisbane. And some 18 years later, you led a renewed investigation into his disappearance and as a result provided evidence at a coronial inquest. Can you have a bit of a chat to us about the Sean Sargent case?
Sean was he was an aspiring officer in the Australian Army. He was progressing well by all reports. On that particular night, Friday night, he went over to a friend's house at Orchard Avenue, St Lucia, attended a bit of a gathering, and then afterwards, with a couple of friends from that party, went to another party in Hawken Drive, St Lucia, which is not very far away. They drove. Whilst at that location, he had a bit of an altercation with one of the occupants of the party at Hawken Drive. As a result, he left the party with the other people that he came with, went back to the address at Orchard. He was seen leaving the house by another male shortly before midnight, and that was the last he was seen. There was a few things that probably should have been done a little bit better at the time. We picked the job up some 18 years later, pieced it back together the best way we could, determined that I think he may have driven his car to go back to the party to make amends with the person he had the altercation with, and in doing so, may have driven his car off the road, which is very close to the Brisbane River, and the car went in, and the car nor Sean Sargent was ever seen again.
18 years after the incident, what's behind that case getting picked up again after such almost 2 decades?
It was put before the coroner, I believe, in 2016. The coroner was concerned with a couple of issues with the brief at that time, and pretty much said, stop and take it away and finish it off and do it properly, sort of thing. And that's where I came in with being contacted by the executive from North Brisbane District to formulate a team. And
were you a homicide detective at that time? Is that why you were assigned a case like this, Mel?
No, I was officer in charge of the Indooroopilly Criminal Investigation Branch. We formulated a bit of a task force with members from City CIB and 2 from Homicide and an intel officer. So we had a team. Initially, there was approximately 8 detectives, 1 intel officer. We then had to capture all the previous information and put it on a system called IMAC, which is used primarily for homicides, but for larger investigations where all the information is captured and then it can be cross-referenced. And it's a really good system that, job logs are created from it, and then you write the job log off back through the system. So everything's captured. That was the system we used for this investigation.
As a serving member of the armed forces at the time, would this have been investigated by the military police as well as civilian police? How does that work?
Yeah, it was. They worked together. The military police liaised with primarily with the missing persons unit of the Queensland Police. They conducted certain inquiries. They were on the same path as us, as in the Sean Sargent and his vehicle may have ended up in the Brisbane River. So they conducted sonar inquiries and so forth with the Border Police. They did it and came up with nothing. But that's not to say the car wasn't there. The University of Queensland has a big lake in it. We had the dive squad there, also at the Enoggera Barracks, where he was obviously linked to, which came up with nil results.
18 or more years on, the finding is that young Sean Sargent, death by misadventure, I guess. How old was he, mate? How old was he at the time of his disappearance?
Just turned 24.
24, just a young fella, yeah?
I think 2 days after his 24th birthday.
There was no shortage of theories and speculation at the time. Is this often the case, as you would know better than anyone, Mel, that when you've got an unexplained disappearance like this and there's no sort of conclusion, that void gets filled with all sorts of sort of scuttlebutt and speculation. What was some of the things that you had to wade through or, I guess, cross off the list with regards to his disappearance?
He had like a Visa debit card. In 99, they were unusual. You couldn't use a debit card like you can use it now. And to use a debit card in 99 required a PIN. There was an attempted use of his card 15 April 99.
3 weeks after the disappearance.
That's right. But picking that investigation up 17, 18 years later was impossible to get any further information. We just knew it happened, but we didn't know where. Obviously couldn't get CCTV footage or anything from the bank as well about it. So, whether someone has picked his card up or whatever from a location, that's speculation.
Yeah, a little bit of a red herring here, but an interesting one, isn't it? The question got to be out, well, where did they get access to that from? Did he drop it accidentally somewhere? Was it washed up on the bank? And yeah.
That's right. And, like on the night that he did go missing, that 19th, he was talking to a girl that had mentioned that he was talking about going AWOL from the army, which I think that Sean was, I think he was a bit of a ladies' man, whether he did that to impress, said that to impress. I certainly don't think there was anything to indicate that he was going to get out of the army, because like I said, he had his future was fairly bright, and, the suicide angle just wasn't there. We even tried to check out the French Foreign Legion. There was some information came in that he joined the Foreign Legion, and you could imagine trying to get information from them, I
think even some talk that he'd been picked up by the SAS Special Air Services in Australia and, used for clandestine sort of operations and things. But again, as we said before, these stories, they just start somewhere in a pub and they gather momentum and they lead to nowhere.
That's right. I eventually took the addendum statement off the sister, Nancy, a lovely lady. Her and Sean were very close. Every time you think about, if he had joined the French Foreign Legion or if he had joined the SAS, which I don't know why that would discourage any communication with family and so forth, but I think that his relationship with his sister in particular was very good, and he would have kept in contact with her, and obviously that wasn't the case.
Did you yourself present the evidence at the coronial inquest?
Yes.
And what was the finding after all of that?
My opinion as to the most likely and plausible cause of Sean's disappearance and death, which was driving the vehicle into the Brisbane River. Death by misadventure. Sean had, I believe it was October of 98, he had a bit of a indiscretion, went to help out a mate at a nightclub or a pub in Townsville. As a result, assaulted a bouncer. At the time, there was some discussion that there was a bit of a scam going on in Townsville with these bouncers, that they were just getting paid off. The bouncer made a criminal complaint of assault, then later withdrew the complaint. In doing so, Sean's bosses were aware of the situation and gave him a fair old dressing down, pretty much put him on notice that his career could be stalled if he has another situation like this. Now, my feeling is that after he'd been to that second party at Hawken Drive and then returned to that original place at Orchard Avenue or Orchard Road, St Lucia, where his car was, I believe he's gotten back into his car and driven, and by this time he's consumed a fair bit of vodka. I think he was returning back to the party to sort that situation out so it wouldn't escalate into a criminal complaint again. That night, the 19th of March, 99 was the darkest night of the year, apparently. Now, there's street lighting and there's a guardrail. But at the time, we actually spoke to an old person that lived nearby who was there at the time, who said that in 99, March of 99, no street lighting, and also the guardrail wasn't there. So he's gone straight up this particular road and just hasn't taken the bend, and he's gone over and it's just straight into the river, and probably no one would have heard a thing.
It's an interesting case, Mel, and no less interesting by the fact that, you know, it was 18 years after the event that of a missing person that you picked it up and investigated, and still quite widely reported all those many years later with folks waiting on that final decision by the coroner. So a really interesting insight.
It was an interesting job, and obviously, what makes it difficult for those types of investigations is time doesn't become your friend. You know, people's memory fades and people move. Look, we put together a pretty good brief at the end that the coroner was very happy with, and I was meeting with him on a regular basis to ensure that he was kept abreast of what was going on and what our plan was and what we were doing.
Coming up, the murder of Allison Baden Clay.
Couldn't take my eyes off him. He was walking around this Prado like he was wanting to take the scent away from the other car.
Mel, on the 20th of April 2012, Brisbane mother of three, Allison Baden Clay, was reported missing by her husband, Gerald. As a detective inspector, you're involved in the early stages of this case as it developed from a missing persons case into a homicide investigation. Can you have a bit of a chat to us about this one?
Yeah, I remember that Friday morning pretty well. Brookfield's a fairly affluent suburb in Brisbane, semi-acreage, nice homes, etc. I went out there pretty much a bit of a sticky beat to have a look at the house and so forth. When I got there, I arrived, there was a lot of police in attendance. A district duty officer, a DDO, who was a senior sergeant, Morel, she came straight up to me and said that serious concerns about Gerard Baden Clay. He'd reported her missing that morning. His demeanour was quite unusual, and not to mention when I looked at the scratch marks on his face, they were fairly serious scratches, which he was claiming they were at that time. He was telling everyone that would listen it was a shaving injury. It was interesting. He was walking around the front of his house. He had two vehicles. One was a silver Toyota Prado. The other was a 2012 Holden Captiva. I remember I was watching him and he was continued to walk around this Prado like he was wanting to take the scent away from the other car. We had a conversation about the marks on his face, to which he replied that they were shaving injuries, which I suggested to him that they weren't. I then spoke to one of the young boys in the office and instructed him to take Mr. Baden Clay away for a statement at Indooroopilly station. At this stage, it's just a missing person. There's nothing sort of going on that's, untoward, except for the scratches. About 20 minutes, half an hour later, I get a phone call from this young detective saying Baden Clay has declined to provide a statement. I said to this young fellow, bring him back. Baden Clay got out of the car and I said, what are you doing, mate? You've declined to provide this statement. I can't recall what he said now, but it was along the lines of he was advised by his lawyer, Darren Marnie, not to provide the statement, to which he then got Marnie to ring me. We had a bit of a disagreement about how he was spoken to by me, and I said to him, if he doesn't provide the statement, we've got no choice but to start hoisting a red flag about this. The property was declared a crime scene. The forensic police come in.
Mel, you talk about these red flags. I mean, you're arriving at that crime scene when we have a homicide or a missing person stroke homicide and it's a domestic related one. The number one suspect's always going to be the partner and in this case, the informant. Through your eyes as an experienced police officer, detective, you're starting to pick up the demeanour of this Baden Clay. You're just starting to get a bit of a feel for him, aren't you? The way that he's acting around police.
Yeah, well, all police. I think we all have a curious sort of nature, whether you call it people watching or whatever, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. And just thinking, this isn't right. And then when he's refusing to provide information to the police about her going missing as the last person to see his wife, you start getting fairly suspicious about the whole thing.
Is Allison's body found prior to charges being laid against the husband?
Yeah, so the IC was commenced late afternoon, Friday the 20th of April. I wanted him completely examined, but that wasn't the case. That didn't happen. And he just took his shirt off, and that's where he claimed to have been bit by a caterpillar at a show, something or other. But it's a classic when someone's getting choked. They tend to get the clothing and pulled in a certain direction, which causes these injuries. He was to front the station on the following day, on the Sunday, for a full forensic procedure. We were then starting to get a lot of information about victimology, about her, about the financial aspect regarding, in particular, Gerard Baden Clay, and it was pretty well established within days that he was in a really, really poor financial state, pretty much owing about $1.2 million. He even had a $40,000 debt on his credit card. So I think I worked out that was about $600 a month, just on his card. Then we started establishing that her life insurance was worth around about the same, about 1.2. So, if she wasn't around anymore, that would sort of wipe his debts. Then on the 30th of April, so about 10 days after, a canoeist is going canoeing down Colo Creek, finds a body on the bank of the Colo Creek, under the Colo Bridge on Mount Presby Road, about 15 kilometres from their house. Funnily enough, it was about the only thing that he told the truth about, as in what she was wearing. He actually said that night that he was watching a footy show and she decided to go for a walk, just never returned. The clothing, he said, what she was wearing is what she was actually found in.
Any forensic evidence there that additionally linked him to the homicide at all?
No, at that stage, I got a phone call that night from Dr. Milne, the pathologist. So unfortunately, we didn't have cause of death.
And so between then, the suspicions mounting against Gerald, the husband, at what point did you have enough, Mel, to pull the trigger and say, okay, we got it, we got enough now to turn the key, lock him up?
It was a circumstantial brief, 4 really big pillars of evidence, as in there was Tony McHugh, the girlfriend. They were in a fairly serious relationship, who provided numerous statements to police that she had to be corrected a number of times. There was obviously the money aspect. I mentioned before about the little holding Captiva that was reversed into the garage. When that was examined, there was some blood found in the third row of the seating of the car. Only a little bit of blood, but nonetheless, that was later discovered to be Allison Baden Clay's blood. So we knew we had her in the car. And I remember on the day that the car was, you had the little registration labels on vehicles, which we don't have anymore, but it was, that car was pretty much brand new. It was 2 months old, and her blood was found in the back seat. So we were starting to gather all these really good bits of circumstantial evidence against him. It was nearly a perfect brief. She was found like I mentioned before, under the bridge at Colo Creek. We wanted to establish that where she was found is where she was actually put in that same location, so she hadn't floated or whatever. So you've got a crime scene. So we looked at a hydrologist. He determined that where she was found is where she was dumped, which meant she never hit the water. The tide never touched her or anything, which was good for our case. We used a associate professor, Jacob John, to establish that she hadn't drowned as well. We were starting to build this really good forensic case. It was nearly checkmate for defence.
And the motive? What would you put forward as motive for the jury?
Tony McHugh, the girlfriend, and the money. He'd mentioned to her that they were going to make a fresh start in July, I believe. Your classic motive, really.
So they make the arrest. He pleads not guilty. He didn't cough to it.
No, that's right.
He was found guilty of murder July 2014. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, which state to state, that's a little bit of a different situation in Australia. Life imprisonment in this case means you can't apply for parole within 15 years. But then there's a few bumps in the road and a few twists and turns after that, I think. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. They appealed. They knocked it down to manslaughter, saying that obviously he didn't mean to kill her. It was quite incredible, the public outpouring over that. People were hitting the streets and protesting and so forth. So then the DPP actually appealed to the High Court, and then that was overturned to the original murder conviction. That's where it ended. And I believe he's due for release in 27.
How does that work under the Queensland system? He can apply for a release at 27, but there's no guarantee that he will get it. How does that work under that life imprisonment?
Yeah, look, who knows? I think that from all reports, I think he's played the game relatively well in prison, but it's beyond my pay grade.
Let's not lose sight of the fact too, Mel and you would have been very close. At three little ones left. How old were those little ones, the kids?
I believe at the time we were under 10. We spoke to the kids and we had to be really careful, and we interviewed them twice. They said nothing, and then that's where it stopped. We didn't want to look like we were bullying the children or, sort of going overboard. So we left it at that. So the arrest was made in mid-June. I briefed the executive of that time, the Metro North region, and the bosses of homicide and state crime. We're different to, say, New South Wales and Victoria, that we, like Indooroopilly CIB, we charge and we're responsible for compiling the brief. We spoke prior to the meeting that I can't see that the brief is getting too much any better, although it did. We had the support of, the media, and they were asking questions about why hasn't an arrest been effected, and I outlined, the job to during this meeting, and then it was accepted and that we'd arrest the next day. Formulated a plan and off we went.
There's quite a long time frame where this Gerald is in the minds of the lead investigators like yourself, the chief suspect. Is he in any way put under some form of surveillance pending his arrest? Because technically he could jump on a plane and disappear, couldn't he?
We were starting to get information from his friends in that area that his mental state was becoming a little bit vulnerable, I guess. He still had custody of the children, obviously. My concern at that time was the 3 young children. So we had a plan in place that, we had a police car very close by, some other covert plans in place that if anything was to possibly happen, we'd be there in seconds.
A very high-profile case, a tragic case, the murder of an innocent woman, a mum, 3 kids left without their mother. A terrible case, but from an investigative perspective, a good end result. And also, the case was strong enough to bounce back against the appeal court and stand up under the High Court scrutiny, that's a wonderful and a reflection on the work that was done. Mel, I just want to thank you so very much for joining us today from up there in Queensland. 36 years of service to the good people of Queensland. I want to thank you so much for that, but also for coming in. A couple of cases, both of which are particularly for our Queensland listeners, but the Allison Baden Clay was a big national case, and it's such an interesting insight. And I just wish you all the very best as you continue to enjoy your time in retirement up there.
Thanks a lot, Brent. Appreciate it.
My guest this week was former Queensland Detective Inspector Mel Gundry. Join us next week for another episode of Crime Insiders Forensics. I'm Brent Sanders, with sound design by Niall Fernandez. This series was recorded and produced on Gadigal land.